Who am I? Why am I here? I'm not a politician, everybody knows that, so don't expect me to use the language of the Washington Insider. 37 years in the Navy, and only one of them up there in Washington. And now I'm an academic. The centerpiece of my life was the Vietnam War. I was there the day it started. I led the first bombing raid against North Vietnam. I was there the day it ended, and I was there for everything in between. 10 years in Vietnam, aerial combat, and torture. I know things about the Vietnam War better than anybody in the world. I know some things about the Vietnam War better than anybody in the world. And I know how governments, how American governments can be courageous and how they can be callow. And that's important. That's one thing I'm an insider on.
Well, that was Admiral Stockdale, the running mate of H. Ross Perot in 1992 vice presidential debate. Could have opened with a more substantial clip. I've opened and or closed some of these lectures with such footage as the I Have a Dream speech or Eisenhower's farewell address to the nation. This is definitely more on the comical side. I enjoy it for two reasons. One, it includes, it's the same response by the same guy, and it happens to be two things at the same time. First, one of the funniest statements ever made on a debate stage ever, his opening line, followed by the most, I don't want to say incoherent, but definitely non-linear, jumbled, irrelevant, not irrelevant in the sense that the guy's a veteran, but he's based, I mean, how much time did he spend talking about the Vietnam War? I can see there was a point there, there's some sort of point there that should have probably, I imagine I would hope there was a writer for this guy, someone to help with his statements, with his speeches, with his debates. Maybe he was his age or he could listen. Who knows? Just a jumbled mess though at the end. But that's Admiral Stockdale, H. Ross Perot, who ran as a third-party candidate. Let's get into that first, actually. Let's go to the second part. The presidential election, 1992, November 1992. Remember, I mentioned that after the Persian Gulf, George H.W. Bush, the 41st president of the United States, is going to have very high approval ratings. These are going to dip substantially. Economic issues, as the whole the war that we saw on TV, waving the flag, and really, as far as a conventional war goes, it was a pretty substantial, clear-cut victory militarily for the United States. As that sort of gets further and further in the distance, economic realities go back to taking a more prominent role, and also such things as the Los Angeles riots, the riots in the wake of the Rodney King verdict, the trial of the 4 police officers who, you say accused of savagely beating Rodney King, which is accurate, except I'm not going to say accused of, because there's actually footage of them savagely beating Rodney King. So everyone deserves their day in court. It's pretty substantial. Although if you look closely, I feel like there's 4 officers. 3 of them have many more years with force, and there's a younger officer with them. And if you watch the tape of the beating of Rodney King, it seems as though the younger officer is not as committed to this situation as the other 3. Right? As far as we're talking about like 50, 60 baton hits to a person's body, many of them to the head. Things that were just not policy, were not legal necessarily for police to do. You could look in our own time. You could look to like the Eric Garner chokehold that was against the rules for police officers, supposedly. I haven't read the New York City Police Officer Handbook, but definitely an aggressive response to a guy in the street. But the city of Los Angeles, particularly South Central Los Angeles, is going to erupt in a uprising, urban uprising, a riot, because these 4 officers put on trial. There's a guy with a camcorder at the time, not digital, so pardon the grainy footage. You guys, we're very fortunate to have digital cameras in our own time, not digital. But even with that footage, these 4 men are acquitted. Los Angeles is a city with a police department that it has, in 1992, you're looking back a generation or two, it doesn't look good as far as race relations, as far as serving the community generally, right? In the 1960s and early 1960s, the Los Angeles Police Department intentionally recruited white men from the South, from Mississippi and Alabama, places like that, to patrol the streets of South Central LA, Watts, right? Deliberately. The Watts uprising. Then, the OJ trial, which follows this, the most important thing to remember about that is that OJ was found not guilty because he had a great legal team, because he was rich. Our criminal justice system is flawed towards favoring people with money. In a society where there's racism, white supremacy, that race tends to play a factor in that, in economic issues, having enough money to pay for a lawyer, right? In the end, OJ would come up because he had a great legal team and he had money. But the LA Police Department, Mark Furman specifically, making racist comments, and various behavior around that case that really discredited the police department, and allowed for reasonable doubt. And one would argue, but 1992, April 29th, after this verdict, these 4 officers are acquitted of the beating of Rodney King. LA basically erupts into flames. A riot, right, with looting. There's it goes on until, I believe, April 29th and May 4th. The National Guard has to come in. This is something we're talking about. May. It goes from late April into early May. The Republicans and the Democrats are going to have their conventions 2 or 3 months after this. So from George H.W. Bush, the incumbent's standpoint, running for re-election, this is not something you want to have in an election. Hurricanes, the hurricane, like Hurricane Sandy and Obama and Chris Christie, and he's with a Republican governor, and it's a natural disaster. He's not, it's not, you can't base it off of economics or policy or anything necessarily that can go back to the president directly, right? Even if you have a president, like our own president, who denies climate change, climate change has any sort of relationship with our own activities as people, right? If there's a natural disaster 2 months from now, you can't blame Donald Trump's stance on climate change for that hurricane happening. Remember, there's lots of really ugly images of these riots, right? You have the beating of Reginald Denny, the white truck driver. Who had a brick thrown in his face by a particular guy who ends up going to jail, right? That's an important thing to note too. That's an important thing to note. The black men caught on camera beating up the white truck driver during the riots, they ended up getting caught and going to jail. They were prosecuted and they were found guilty. Unlike the police officers that beat Rodney King, which catapulted into the riots. You know what I'm saying? Of businesses, you have these neighborhoods. You have neighborhoods, and if you see like the film Boys to Men, this issue is discussed in that film. It's been referenced in the textbook. There's communities that are predominantly black where there are businesses that are predominantly owned by immigrant groups, and specifically there's a sort of image of the Korean supermarket or Korean market owner in some of these neighborhoods that are affected by the riots, and many of these business owners had their places destroyed, had to defend their businesses with firearms, and there's a real if you look at the culture war speech, Pat Buchanan's culture war speech, at the end he references this in a way. On the one hand, he's trying to appeal to immigrant groups, which is, Pat Buchanan at the time is this really staunch conservative, way too far to the right for the mainstream Republican Party, and yet his stance on immigration, extending an olive branch to these immigrant groups, these Korean store owners, is much more substantial than the current president and his views on immigration. But many see it as real, pitting groups against each other. These angry black youths with their rap albums, and they're sagging pants. They don't want to work. They're breaking stuff. They're breaking up your stores. Those are Democrats right there, right? Because African Americans substantially vote for the Democratic Party. Depicting them as all on welfare, and the welfare state being something the Democrats have perpetuated, and sort of pitting us against them. Like, we're on the side of you guys, you immigrants who own stores and stuff. The riot itself destroyed lots of property, and then people capitalized on it in various ways politically. It could not have been a positive from George H.W. Bush's standpoint, who is not going to be reelected, right? The presidential election in 1992, it's possible he would have been reelected and he would have defeated Bill Clinton had it not been for a third-party candidate, a Texas billionaire named H. Ross Perot, who runs for president, third party. I don't recall if it was called for a reform party yet, but this run for presidency in the presidency in '92 by Ross Perot is basically going to sort of evolve into what is known as the Reform Party, which has Jesse Ventura was a Reform Party member when he was governor of Minnesota. Donald Trump ran for the Reform Party nomination, or I believe he ran as a Reform Party candidate for president in 2000. I can't recall. He ran, it might have been in the primary. But H. Ross Perot receives nearly 19 million votes. 19.7 million votes, 18.8%. So he got about 19 million votes and 19% of the vote. If you recall, the Eugene Debs is highlighted in the Progressive era for receiving 1 million votes. At the time, that was 6% of the vote. This guy has nearly 19% of the vote. 92, Ross Perot, right? That's 3 times more. So not only substantially more than a Debs, but who is obviously substantially more than third-party candidates today that get 1 or 2%, maybe 3% of the vote. Granted, Debs didn't have billions of dollars to run for president. And what's interesting is that Ross Perot actually in this election, he runs again in '96, but he runs for president, and his numbers were actually significantly higher. He drops out of the race, and I can't recall why off the top of my head, but he gets back in the race, and he's a wealthy person, sort of espousing a more conservative economic platform. So it's likely that those 19, 20 million people that voted for him, not all of them, but the majority, it would be a very valid statement, I think, or very possible to say that more than half would have voted for George Bush if Ross Perot were not in this race, right? And if you take these votes and divide, because Bill Clinton does not get 50% of the vote, right? He does not get over 50% of the vote. Like Lincoln in 1860, who only gets 40% of the vote, Bill Clinton ends up with 43%, because there was more than 2 candidates, right? So instead of ending up with a situation where one candidate gets 53%, the other gets 46%, and then it's divided among multiple candidates, and no one ever hits that 50% threshold. This happens in 1824. This happens in 1860. It happened in 1912 with Woodrow Wilson and Taft and Roosevelt, and it happens in 1992. Right? And it probably happened in 1948 also, but in 1992. So Bill Clinton is elected president with 43% of the vote. He wins the Electoral College substantially, right? He wins if you look at an electoral map, it's very similar to how an electoral map looks pretty much every year nowadays, with the exception that he ends up pulling in some pretty solid southern states. He wins Georgia, he wins Louisiana, he is the governor of Arkansas, so he wins that state, Missouri and Tennessee, and Kentucky. Does really well. these, this electoral map has certain states where, they're going to go for the Democrats no matter what, and then he's able to pull it up enough, sort of what they would call purple states, not between Democrats and Republicans, sort of toss up, to win the electoral college substantially, right? And he does, even though he doesn't get 50% of the vote, he has about 6 million more votes than George H.W. Bush gets. He wins. He has about 6 percentage points more of the popular vote, and he, as far as the sheer numbers, he gets about 6 million more votes. So, if you were going to divide up the Ross Perot votes, he didn't run, and those people still voted for somebody, Clinton or Bush. George Bush would have to win a substantial majority, like not just more than half, but a super majority. 67% of those votes would have to go Bush and just tie Clinton, because Clinton ends up getting 6 million more votes than George H.W. Bush, and that is actually twice as many more votes. So Clinton gets twice as many more votes in '92 as his wife got in the last election. She got 3 million more votes than Donald Trump. The difference is that Bill Clinton substantially won the Electoral College and Hillary Clinton lost in the Electoral College. So we get Bill Clinton. We get a Democrat as president. And it's important to remember, I think it's important to remember, though, that, when I reference the transitional presidents, Eisenhower, right? You have 20 years of Democrats, Roosevelt and Truman. Then you get this guy Eisenhower, Republican, who does not fundamentally alter the New Deal policies, the Fair Deal policies. He does not try to dismantle this welfare state, these big democratic programs, right? He continues them, expands them in many ways, just begins his own massive government projects like the interstate highway system. I think with Bill Clinton, and then also more recently with Barack Obama, they are Democrats, but you have to look at them within the framework of the Reagan Revolution, right? They're functioning as president in a world that has been left to them by the Reagan-Bush era. One example, just to look at one example of what I'm talking about, taxes, the tax rate for the wealthiest Americans. When Ronald Reagan takes office in 1981, it is 70%. The wealthiest Americans pay 70% of their income, 70% of their income in taxes. When he leaves office, 28%. That number, the wealthiest Americans pay 28% of their income in taxes, right? Currently today, after 8 years of Democratic president, Obama, it's at, 35%, 38% for the wealthiest people in this country. So that's closer to 28%, the 28% that Reagan wanted, not, rather than the 70%, 80% that existed under, before Reagan became president, under, Johnson and Roosevelt. So even though there's a Democrat in the White House, he's functioning in the wake of this Reagan-Bush era. And within 2 years of his administration, like Barack Obama, he's going to lose control of Congress. There's going to be a sort of a push from conservatives across the country to get conservative Republicans into Congress. They are led by Newt Gingrich, who becomes the Speaker of the House, and they are led by a platform, an agenda that they call a contract with America. Ends up functioning in a more conservative America, an America where Ronald Reagan has had a very important role in shaping how things look, and also a Republican Congress. So you get welfare reform. You get the reform of welfare. If you look here, it says aid to families with dependent children. What has been referred to as the end of welfare, right? Or creating more requirements for seeking work or actively working or working for the government in order to collect benefits. There's various things that. But basically severely curtailing the kind of welfare and how people receive it, how much they receive. And you can look into that however you want. Some people think you can support that. Some people think that there shouldn't be any form of welfare or food stamps. That's fine. Everyone has the right to their opinion. So I'm not trying to tell you how to think necessarily. But welfare reform, it's not on this list, but DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, right? Which was overturned recently by the Supreme Court about 5 years ago. But this saying that marriage the institution of marriage solely between a man and a woman, right? Signed into law by Bill Clinton. Don't ask, don't tell, which at the time maybe was seen as a progressive position, but eventually is seen as a discriminatory thing. Right? Don't ask, don't tell policy in the military, where you don't ask someone's sexual orientation and you don't tell your sexual orientation, which clearly is an unequal thing because it's only applying to gays and lesbians, right? If I have a wedding ring on and I'm in the military, if I show you a picture of my wife, I'm telling you my sexual orientation, I'm not going to get kicked out of the military for that, right? It's targeting gay people and telling them to just be quiet about their lifestyle and telling others not to inquire, right? So, neither one of those are on this list, but the aided families with dependent children, the welfare reform, the repeal of Glass-Steagall, right? The banking regulation put in place during the New Deal is repealed, and this repeal is cited as by some economists as one of the things that leads to the recession of 2008, 2009. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which is a very divisive issue, still divisive to this day, about opening up trade between Canada and Mexico. Many would argue loosening restrictions on corporations so they can go into other countries for cheap labor, go into other countries where there are less environmental regulations, and basically lay off people, workers in America, and open a factory in northern Mexico, which these factory towns are referred to as the maquiladoras, which in some instances have very poor living conditions and poor pay. I'm not sure about all of them though. And there's also the argument that technology, machines doing work, would have replaced many of the American workers who claim to have lost their jobs from NAFTA, right? From free trade, the idea of free trade, which is really, this is an opinion, but free trade really, I mean, in our own time, in the modern world, when it comes to a big trade agreement like this, it usually means the big guys trading, corporations being able to go overseas, right? Unfettered. Because a guy who crosses the border from Mexico into the United States and sells oranges on a corner in San Diego or Los Angeles, that's free trade. That's someone coming here and selling their labor, right? But that guy's an illegal immigrant. But it's okay for Coca-Cola or GM or somebody to go, to lay off thousands of workers in America and build a factory somewhere else. Anyways, it's a very divisive issue. Also, from an environmental standpoint, a lot of trade agreements, there's issues of affecting indigenous populations in the countries you are going into with these trade agreements. Affecting American workers, because you're going into these other countries to get cheaper labor, thereby you're going to fire Americans, right? The idea of America not manufacturing stuff anymore, becoming a sort of niche of service industry jobs, right? So, and then the environment, going into countries with more lax or no regulations so that people can pollute, cut corners like in a way that would harm the planet, possibly without any fear of culpability, being found culpable and being fined, in jail or whatever. So NAFTA. What else is on his list? We got Glass-Steagall. Oh yeah, so in Seattle, Washington in 1999, the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization, is going to have a meeting in Seattle. It relates to that what I just said about NAFTA, particularly when it comes to the environment. We usually watch the documentary The True Falls about the Earth Liberation Front, which is some members, I believe, are in this picture you see right here. Yeah, they're not like at a rave right there where those bandanas are covered in Vicks Vapor Rub and they're on ecstasy. That's a protest, so against the World Trade Organization. Yeah, 1999. And then, of course, the Bush versus Gore election. Why does it say presidential election in 1992 up there? And down here it says Bush v. Gore, and it's in italics. That's because that is actually a Supreme Court case. Why? Because the Supreme Court, in essence, decides the 2000 election, right? There's disputed voter issues in Florida. The electoral votes are up in the air. Initially, George Bush is declared the winner. there is a recount. There's a process of a recount, and in that recount with George Bush ahead of Al Gore by, I believe, this is the other George Bush, the son of the guy we just talked about in 92. I believe he was ahead of Al Gore by 538 votes when the Supreme Court ordered the recount to stop, basically. Or it was they had halted it. The Supreme Court intervenes and declares Bush the winner. And their argument sort of is an interesting one. If you want to say what to do. I'd say the important things from this slide: Glass-Steagall, the understanding some of these policies, the welfare reform, the Glass-Steagall, right? A Democrat really, not only is a Democrat not expanding on policies that his party, like welfare, like New Deal policies, right? There's a Democrat in the White House, and Bill Clinton is the first Democrat to serve 2 full terms, a full 8-year administration, since Franklin Roosevelt, who served even longer, right? And there's only three in the entire century, Democrats: Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, and Bill Clinton, right? Because, anybody else, LBJ was reelected, but he did not serve a full 8 years. Truman, same thing. And he's actually rolling back on a lot of progressive, or what you call progressive or liberal Democratic policies. Like rolling back on New Deal regulation of the banks, rolling back on the concept of welfare. The country possibly becoming more conservative than it previously had been, right? Sort of rolling back on liberalism. Liberalism still may be being discredited, like we see in the 70s. Related to the country becoming more conservative, the Oklahoma City bombing, right? Committed by a bombing which kills 168 people, the Oklahoma City Federal Building. The bomb planted, it was explosives and flammable material in a rental truck, a Ryder rental truck, parked by a former Persian Gulf veteran named Timothy McVeigh, right? Who was sort of associated with some right-wing, anti-government, anti-federal government folks, and in many instances, those groups tend to be strange bedfellows or are themselves directly involved in the Ku Klux Klan, white supremacist stuff. So, there's this terrorist act, basically, and up to that point, it was the largest terrorist act as far as the number of people it killed in America until 9/11. And it's still, other than 9/11, the most substantial. And it's 1995, and there is early speculation that it was an Islamic terrorist group, a jihadist group, whatever you want to call it, that carried this out, and mosques are going to be attacked. People are going to throw bricks through mosques. Hate crimes are going to be committed against people of Muslim faith. And probably people who aren't of the Muslim faith, like Sikhs and Hindu people from India, Pakistan, there's lots of jackasses in this country that are really ignorant. I probably should have come up with a more articulate way of saying that. But yeah, it's going to be this a veteran, right? Timothy McVeigh. And I think sometime around then, too, in the mid-late 90s, you have the apprehension of the Unabomber, right? Ted Kaczynski, who was a professor at Berkeley. So, a lot of homegrown terrorism. You have the ELF, the Earth Liberation Front, which, if you want to consider them a terrorist group or not, that's fine, but still